Steph. 571 Republic 9. Socrates, Adimantus. Last of all comes the tyrannical man, about whom we have once more to ask, how is he formed out of the democratical? And how does he live, in happiness or in misery? Yes, he said, he is the only one remaining. There is, however, I said, a previous question which remains unanswered. What question? A digression having a purpose. I do not think that we have adequately determined the nature and number of the appetites, and until this is accomplished, the inquiry will always be confused. Well, he said, it is not too late to supply the omission. The wild beast latent in man peers forth in sleep. Very true, I said, and observe the point which I want to understand. Certain of the unnecessary pleasures and appetites I conceive to be unlawful, everyone appears to have them, but in some persons they are controlled by the laws and by reason, and the better desires prevail over them. Either they are wholly banished or they become few and weak, while in the case of others they are stronger, and there are more of them. Which appetites do you mean? I mean those which are awake when the reasoning and human and ruling power is asleep. Then the wild beast within us, gorged with meat or drink, starts up and having shaken off sleep, goes forth to satisfy his desires, and there is no conceivable folly or crime, not excepting incest or any other unnatural union, or parricide, or the eating of forbidden food, which at such a time, when he has parted company with all shame and sense, a man may not be ready to commit. Most true, he said. The contrast of the temperate man whose passions are under the control of reason. But when a man's pulse is healthy and temperate, and when before going to sleep he has awakened his rational 281 powers, and fed them on noble thoughts and inquiries, collecting himself in meditation, after having first indulged his appetites neither too much nor too little, but just enough to lay them to sleep, and prevent them in their enjoyments 572 and pains from interfering with the higher principle which he leaves in the solitude of pure abstraction, free to contemplate and aspire to the knowledge of the unknown, whether in past, present, or future, when again he has allayed the passionate element, if he has a quarrel against anyone, I say, when, after pacifying the two irrational principles, he rouses up the third, which is reason, before he takes his rest, then, as you know, he attains truth most nearly, and is least likely to be the sport of fantastic and lawless visions. I quite agree. In saying this I have been running into a digression, but the point which I desire to note is that in all of us, even in good men, there is a lawless wild beast nature, which peers out in sleep. Pray, consider whether I am right, and you agree with me. Yes, I agree. Recapitulation. And now remember the character which we attributed CTO the democratic man. He was supposed from his youth upwards to have been trained under a miserly parent, who encouraged the saving appetites in him, but discountenanced the unnecessary, which aim only at amusement and ornament? True. And then he got into the company of a more refined, licentious sort of people, and taking to all their wanton ways rushed into the opposite extreme from an abhorrence of his father's meanness. At last, being a better man than his corruptors, he was drawn in both directions until he halted midway and led a life, not of vulgar and slavish passion, but of what he deemed moderate indulgence in various pleasures. After this manner the democrat was generated out of the oligarch? Yes, he said, that was our view of him, and is so still. And now, I said, years will have passed away, and you must conceive this man, such as he is, to have a son, who was brought up in his father's principles. I can imagine him. 282. Then you must further imagine the same thing to happen to the son which has already happened to the father. He is drawn into a perfectly lawless life, which by his seducers is termed perfect liberty, and his father and friends take part with his moderate desires, and the opposite party assists the opposite ones. As soon as these dire magicians and 573 tyrant makers find that they are losing their hold on him, they contrive to implant in him a master passion, to be lord over his idle and spendthrift lusts, a sort of monstrous winged drone that is the only image which will adequately describe him. Yes, he said, that is the only adequate image of him. And when his other lusts, amid clouds of incense and perfumes and garlands and wines, and all the pleasures of a dissolute life, now let loose, come buzzing around him, nourishing to the utmost the sting of desire which they implant in his drone-like nature, then at last this lord of Beeth's soul, having madness for the captain of his guard, breaks out into a frenzy, and if he finds in himself any good opinions or appetites in process of formation one, and there is in him any sense of shame remaining, to these better principles he puts an end, and casts them forth until he has purged away temperance and brought in madness to the full. 1. Or, opinions or appetites such as are deemed to be good. The tyrannical man is made up of lusts and appetites. Love, drink, madness are but different forms of tyranny. Yes, he said, that is the way in which the tyrannical man is generated. And is not this the reason why of old love has been called a tyrant? I should not wonder. Further, I said, has not a drunken man also the spirit of a tyrant? He has. And you know that a man who is deranged and not right in his mind will fancy that he is able to rule, not only over men, but also over the gods? That he will. And the tyrannical man in the true sense of the word comes into being when, either under the influence of nature, or habit, or both, he becomes drunken, lustful, passionate? Oh, my friend, is not that so? 283. Assuredly. Such is the man and such is his origin. And next, how does he live? Do suppose, as people facetiously say, you were to tell me? I imagine, I said, at the next step in his progress, that there will be feasts and carousals and revellings and courtesans, and all that sort of thing. Love is the lord of the house within him, and orders all the concerns of his soul. That is certain. Yes, and every day and every night desires grow up many and formidable, and their demands are many. They are indeed, he said. His revenues, if he has any, are soon spent. True. Then comes debt and the cutting down of his property. Of course. His desires become greater and his means less. When he has nothing left, must not his desires, crowding in the nest like young ravens, be crying aloud for food, and 574 goaded on by them, and especially by love himself, who is in a manner the captain of them, is in a frenzy, and would fain discover whom he can defraud or despoil of his property, in order that he may gratify them? Yes, that is sure to be the case. He must have money, no matter how, if he is to escape horrid pains and pangs. He must. He will rob his father and mother. And as in himself there was a succession of pleasures, and the new got the better of the old and took away their rights, so he being younger will claim to have more than his father and his mother, and if he has spent his own share of the property, he will take a slice of theirs. No doubt he will. And if his parents will not give way, then he will try first of all to cheat and deceive them. Very true. And if he fails, then he will use force and plunder them. Yes, probably. And if the old man and woman fight for their own, what then, my friend? Will the creature feel any compunction at tyrannizing over them? 284. Nay, he said, I should not feel at all comfortable about his parents. He will prefer the love of a girl or a youth to his aged parents, and may even be induced to strike them. But, oh heavens! Adimantus, on account of some newfangled love of a harlot, who was anything but a necessary connection, Can you believe that he would strike the mother who was his ancient friend and necessary to his very existence, and would place her under the authority of the other, when she is brought under the same roof with her, or that, under like circumstances, he would do the same to his withered old father, first and most indispensable of friends, for the sake of some newly found blooming youth who is the reverse of indispensable? Yes, indeed, he said, I believe that he would. Truly, then, I said, a tyrannical son is a blessing to his father and mother. He is indeed, he replied. He turns highwayman, robs temples, loses all his early principles, and becomes in waking reality the evil dream which he had in sleep. He gathers followers about him. He first takes their property, and when that fails, and pleasures are beginning to swarm in the hive of his soul, then he breaks into a house, or steals the garments of some nightly wayfarer. Next he proceeds to clear a temple. Meanwhile the old opinions which he had when a child, and which gave judgment about good and evil, are overthrown by those others which have just been emancipated, and are now the bodyguard of love and share his empire. These in his democratic days, when he was still subject to the laws e'en to his father, were only let loose in the dreams of sleep. But now that he is under the dominion of love, he becomes always and in waking reality what he was then very rarely and in a dream only. He will commit the foulest murder, or eat forbidden food, or be guilty of any other horrid act. 575 Love is his tyrant, and lives lordly in him and lawlessly, and being himself a king, leads him on, as a tyrant leads a state, to the performance of any reckless deed by which he can maintain himself in the rabble of his associates, whether those whom evil communications have brought in from without, or those whom he himself has allowed to break loose within him by reason of a similar evil nature in himself. Have we not here a picture of his way of life? Yes, indeed, he said. And if there are only a few of them in the state, and the 285 breast of the people are well disposed, they go away and become the bodyguard or mercenary soldiers of some other tyrant who may probably want them for a war, and if there is no war, they stay at home and do many little pieces of mischief in the city. What sort of mischief? For example, they are the thieves, burglars, cutpurses, footpads, robbers of temples, manstealers of the community, or if they are able to speak they turn informers, and bear false witness, and take bribes. See a small catalogue of evils, even if the perpetrators of them are few in number. A private person can do but little harm in comparison of the tyrant. Yes, I said, but small and great are comparative terms, and all these things, in the misery and evil which they inflict upon a state, do not come within 1,000 miles of the tyrant. When this noxious class and their followers grow numerous and become conscious of their strength, assisted by the infatuation of the people, they choose from among themselves the one who has most of the tyrant in his own soul, damn him, they create their tyrant. Yes, he said, and he will be the most fit to be a tyrant. If the people yield, well and good, but if they resist him, as he began by beating his own father and mother, so now, if he has the power, he beats them, and will keep his dear old fatherland or motherland, as the Cretans say, in subjection to his young retainers whom he has introduced to be their rulers and masters. This is the end of his passions and desires. Exactly. The behavior of the tyrant to his early supporters. When such men are only private individuals and before they get power, this is their character. They associate entirely with their own flatterers or ready tools, or if they want anything from anybody, they in their turn are equally ready to bow down before them. They profess every sort of 576 affection for them, but when they have gained their point they know them no more. Yes, truly. He is always either master or servant, always treacherous, unjust, the waking reality of our dream, a tyrant by nature, a tyrant in fact. They are always either the masters or servants and never the friends of anybody. The tyrant never tastes of true freedom or friendship. 286. Certainly not. And may we not rightly call such men treacherous? No question. B. Also they are utterly unjust, if we were right in our notion of justice? Yes, he said, and we were perfectly right. Let us then sum up in a word, I said, the character of the worst man. He is the waking reality of what we dreamed. Most true. And this is he who, being by nature most of a tyrant, bears rule, and the longer he lives the more of a tyrant he becomes. Socrates, Glaucon. That is certain, said Glaucon, taking his turn to answer. The wicked are also the most miserable. And will not he who has been shown to be the wickedest, CBE, also the most miserable? And he who has tyrannized longest and most continually and truly miserable, although this may not be the opinion of men in general? Yes, he said, inevitably. Like man, like state. And must not the tyrannical man be like the tyrannical state, and the democratical man like the democratical state, and the same of the others? Certainly. And as state is to state in virtue and happiness, so is man in relation to man? D. To be sure. The opposite of the king. Then comparing our original city, which was under a king, and the city which is under a tyrant, how do they stand as to virtue? They are the opposite extremes, he said, for one is the very best and the other is the very worst. There can be no mistake, I said, as to which is which, and therefore I will at once inquire whether you would arrive at a similar decision about their relative happiness and misery. And here we must not allow ourselves to be panic-stricken at the apparition of the tyrant, who is only a unit and may perhaps have a few retainers about him, but let us go as we ought into every corner of the city and look all about, and then we will give our opinion. A fair invitation, he replied, and I see, as everyone must, that a tyranny is the wretchedest form of government, and the rule of a king the happiest. 287. And in estimating the men too, may I not fairly make 577 a like request, that I should have a judge whose mind can enter into and see through human nature? He must not be like a child who looks at the outside and is dazzled at the pompous aspect which the tyrannical nature assumes to the beholder, but let him be one who has a clear insight. May I suppose that the judgment is given in the hearing of us all by one who was able to judge, and has dwelt in the same place with him, and been present at his daily life and known Beam and his family relations, where he may be seen stripped of his tragedy attire, and again in the hour of public danger he shall tell us about the happiness and misery of the tyrant when compared with other men? That again, he said, is a very fair proposal. Shall I assume that we ourselves are able and experienced judges and have before now met with such a person? We shall then have someone who will answer our inquiries. By all means. See, let me ask you not to forget the parallel of the individual and the state. Bearing this in mind, and glancing in turn from one to the other of them, will you tell me their respective conditions? What do you mean? He asked. The state is not free, but enslaved. Beginning with the state, I replied, would you say that a city which is governed by a tyrant is free or enslaved? No city, he said, can be more completely enslaved. And yet, as you see, there are freemen as well as masters in such a state? Yes, he said, I see that there are a few, but the people, speaking generally, and the best of them are miserably degraded and enslaved. D. Like a slave, the tyrant is full of meanness, and the ruling part of him is madness. Then if the man is like the state, I said, must not the same rule prevail? His soul is full of meanness and vulgarity, the best elements in him are enslaved, and there is a small ruling part, which is also the worst and maddest. Inevitably. And would you say that the soul of such an one is the soul of a freeman, or of a slave? He has the soul of a slave, in my opinion. 288. And the state which is enslaved under a tyrant is utterly incapable of acting voluntarily? Utterly incapable. The city which is subject to him is goaded by a gadfly, and also the soul which is under a tyrant, I am speaking of the soul taken as a whole, is least capable of doing what she desires. There is a gadfly which goads her, and she is full of trouble and remorse? Certainly. And is the city which is under a tyrant rich or poor? Poor. 578 poor. And the tyrannical soul must be always poor and insatiable? True. And must not such a state and such a man be always full of fear? Yes, indeed. Full of misery. Is there any state in which you will find more of lamentation and sorrow and groaning and pain? Certainly not. And is there any man in whom you will find more of this sort of misery than in the tyrannical man, who is in a fury of passions and desires? Impossible. Be reflecting upon these and similar evils, you held the tyrannical state to be the most miserable of states? And I was right, he said. Also, the tyrannical man is most miserable. Certainly, I said. And when you see the same evils in the tyrannical man, what do you say of him? I say that he is by far the most miserable of all men. Yet there is a still more miserable being, the tyrannical man who is a public tyrant. There, I said, I think that you are beginning to go wrong. What do you mean? I do not think that he has as yet reached the utmost extreme of misery. Then who is more miserable? One of whom I am about to speak. Who is that? See, he who is of a tyrannical nature, and instead of leading a private life has been cursed with the further misfortune of being a public tyrant. From what has been said, I gather that you are right. 289. Yes, I replied, but in this high argument you should be a little more certain, and should not conjecture only, for of all questions, this respecting good and evil is the greatest. Very true, he said. Let me then offer you an illustration, which may, I think, throw a light upon this subject. What is your illustration? In cities there are many great slave owners, and they help to protect one another. The case of rich individuals in cities who possess many slaves, from them you may form an idea of the tyrant's condition, for they both have slaves, the only difference is that he has more slaves. Yes, that is the difference. You know that they live securely and have nothing to apprehend from their servants? What should they fear? Nothing. But do you observe the reason of this? Yes, the reason is that the whole city is leagued together for the protection of each individual. But suppose a slave owner and his slaves carried off into the wilderness, what will happen then? Such is the condition of the tyrant. Very true, I said. But imagine one of these owners, the master say of some 50 slaves, together with his family and property and slaves, carried off by a god into the wilderness, where there are no freemen to help him. Will he not be in an agony of fear lest he and his wife and children should be put to death by his slaves? Yes, he said, he will be in the utmost fear. 579 The time has arrived when he will be compelled to flatter divers of his slaves, and make many promises to them of freedom and other things. Much against his will, he will have to cajole his own servants. Yes, he said, that will be the only way of saving himself. And suppose the same God, who carried him away, to surround him with neighbors who will not suffer one man to be the master of another, and who, if they could catch the offender, would take his life? His case will be still worse, if you suppose him to be everywhere surrounded and watched by enemies. He is the daintiest of all men and has to endure the hardships of a prison, and is not this the sort of prison in which the tyrant will be bound, he who being by nature such as we have described, is full of all sorts of fears and lusts? His soul is dainty and greedy, and yet alone, of all men in the city, he is never 290 allowed to go on a journey, or to see the things which other freemen desire to see, but he lives in his hole like a woman shidden in the house, and is jealous of any other citizen who goes into foreign parts and sees anything of interest. Very true, he said. Miserable in himself, he is still more miserable if he be in a public station. And amid evils such as these will not he who is ill-governed in his own person, the tyrannical man, whom you just now decided to be the most miserable of all, will not he be yet more miserable when, instead of leading a private life, he is constrained by fortune to be a public tyrant? He has to be master of others when he is not master of himself. He is like a diseased or paralytic man who is compelled to pass his life, not in retirement, but fighting and combating with other men. Yes, he said, the similitude is most exact. He then leads a life worse than the worst. Is not his case utterly miserable? And does not the actual tyrant lead a worse life than he whose life you determine to be the worst? Certainly. In unhappiness, he who is the real tyrant, whatever men may think, is the real slave, and is obliged to practice the greatest adulation and servility, and to be the flatterer of the vilest of mankind. He has desires which he is utterly unable to satisfy, and has more wants than anyone, and is truly poor. If you know how to inspect the whole soul of him, all his life long he is beset with fear and is full of convulsions and distractions, even as the state which he resembles, and surely the resemblance holds? Very true, he said. 580 And in wickedness. Moreover, as we were saying before, he grows worse from having power. He becomes and is of necessity more jealous, more faithless, more unjust, more friendless, more impious, than he was at first. He is the purveyor and cherisher of every sort of vice, and the consequence is that he is supremely miserable, and that he makes everybody else as miserable as himself. No man of any sense will dispute your words. The umpire decides that. Come then, I said, and as the general umpire in theatrical contests proclaims the result, do you also decide who in your opinion is first in the scale of happiness, and who second, 291, and in what order the others follow. There are 5 of them in all. They are the royal, timocratical, oligarchical, democratical, tyrannical. The decision will be easily given, he replied. They shall be choruses coming on the stage, and I must judge them in the order in which they enter, by the criterion of virtue and vice, happiness and misery. The best is the happiest and the worst is the most miserable. This is the proclamation of the son of Ariston. Need we hire a herald, or shall I announce, that the son of Ariston, the best, has decided that the best in justice is also the happiest, and that this is he who is the most royal man and king over himself, and that the worst and most unjust man is also the most miserable, and that this is he who being the greatest tyrant of himself is also the greatest tyrant of his state? Make the proclamation yourself, he said. And shall I add, whether seen or unseen by gods and men? Let the words be added. Then this, I said, will be our first proof, and there is an other, which may also have some weight. What is that? Proof, derived from the 3 principles of the soul. The second proof is derived from the nature of the soul, seeing that the individual soul, like the state, has been divided by us into 3 principles. The division may, I think, furnish a new demonstration. Of what nature? It seems to me that to these 3 principles 3 pleasures correspond, also 3 desires and governing powers. How do you mean? He said. There is one principle with which, as we were saying, a man learns, another with which he is angry, the third, behaving many forms, has no special name, but is denoted by the general term appetitive, from the extraordinary strength and vehemence of the desires of eating and drinking and the other sensual appetites which are the main elements of it. 581 Also money-loving, because such desires are generally satisfied by the help of money. That is true, he said. 1. The appetitive. If we were to say that the loves and pleasures of this third part were concerned with gain, we should then be 292 able to fall back on a single notion, and might truly and intelligibly describe this part of the soul as loving gain or money. I agree with you. Again, is not the passionate element wholly set on ruling and conquering and getting fame? Be true. 2. The ambitious, suppose we call it the contentious or ambitious, would the term be suitable? Extremely suitable. 3. The principle of knowledge and truth. On the other hand, everyone sees that the principle of knowledge is wholly directed to the truth, and cares less than either of the others for gain or fame. Far less. Lover of wisdom, lover of knowledge, are titles which we may fitly apply to that part of the soul? Certainly. One principle prevails in the souls of one class of men, can other in others, as may happen? Yes. Then we may begin by assuming that there are three classes of men: lovers of wisdom, lovers of honor, lovers of gain? Exactly. And there are three kinds of pleasure, which are their several objects. Very true. Each will depreciate the others, but only the philosopher has the power to judge. Now, if you examine the three classes of men, and ask of them in turn which of their lives is pleasantest, each will be found praising his own and depreciating that of others. Death money-maker will contrast the vanity of honor or of learning if they bring no money with the solid advantages of gold and silver? True, he said. And the lover of honor, what will be his opinion? Will he not think that the pleasure of riches is vulgar, while the pleasure of learning, if it brings no distinction, is all smoke and nonsense to him? Very true. 293. Because he alone has experience of the highest pleasures and is also acquainted with the lower. And are we to suppose too, I said, that the philosopher sets any value on other pleasures in comparison with the pleasure of knowing the truth, and in that pursuit abiding, ever learning, not so far indeed from the heaven of pleasure? Does he not call the other pleasures necessary, under the idea that if there were no necessity for them, he would rather not have them?